Meanwhile, the NYDA will be hosting the 9th Youth BRICS Summit and Ministers Meeting 2023 in KwaZulu-Natal. And they will, amongst the players, have some of the ministers in charge of the youth agenda within those BRICS countries. Let's get more on what will be discussed there. We're joined now by the CEO of the NYDA, Waseem Carrim. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Except for, of course, having stakeholders within the youth space and doing it for the 9th time and bringing in some ministers who are in charge of the youth affairs. What exactly are we hoping to come out of it? I mean, it's not just people coming to have dialogue and to talk. What are some of the concrete things that people can expect to come out of this that will be incorporated into the Africa BRICS youth agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Tabu. Good evening, and good evening to your viewers as well. Hope everyone's staying warm. It's cold weather. So I think if you reflect on where South Africa is at, South Africa has very individual domestic interests, but we also have foreign interests, right? And we know where we are. Young people in South Africa want access to opportunities, right? So if you think about young entrepreneurs, for example, they don't only want to succeed at home, they also want to grow their business into the continent, but also internationally. And I think spaces like this open up opportunities. You know, you think about young people who are in academics and, for example, the international kind of study opportunities that these sort of forums open up for them to go and explore their interests in different countries, in accessing some of the world's better universities, in becoming multilingual, for example. You know, you talk about the networking opportunities for young South Africans. You know, for pre-democracy, South Africa was a very closed economy. Now you have the opportunity for us to interact with counterparts, and also serving as learning exchanges, for example. We know that the world is now a global village. You know, we connect with each other differently. So this is a huge opportunity for young people in South Africa to be exposed to their international counterparts, to learn new things, to understand how the world is advancing, and to incorporate some of those learning exchanges here at home. Yeah.
So from the previous youth summit that was in China, one of the key focus areas, for example, and we'll touch on a couple of them, but tell me how far we have gone as the continent to address the question of building, then they said rural economies, but I'll add to that and say township economies as well, through access to technology.
Yeah, thanks, Tabu. So I think if you think about, you know, the way in which BRICS has worked, for example, right, and you think about all of the countries that are represented in them, all of them have a variety of histories that they come from, right? And I mean, we know China, for example, is one of the world's economies that has really grown massively. They've lifted half of their population out of poverty, for example, right? And I think a lot of the strategies that they have implemented, some of them have similarly been implemented in South Africa. For example, in South Africa, we've seen in democracy many cities that were smaller before. I'll give you an example. Polokwane, Nelspruit, Mobela, for example, have really grown from being very small towns into larger and have benefited from a variety of economic interests. Now, it's also about understanding in a modern day economy how you take very rural, township-based, as you say, and transform those into hubs of opportunity for young people in the country. Yeah, and I think you make a critical point in that technology is very important in that. So, for example, something like bridging the digital divide is critically important. Transforming skills in education and how young people learn in environments that are different from those in urban areas is very important. It's also important to deal with how you deal with rapid urbanization in South Africa and across the world. Yeah. So I think these are some of the topics that are important to explore and to transfer learnings from different countries, but also to attract international investment to solve some of the problems that South Africa is facing. Yeah.
So have we moved past the point? You know, previously they blamed NYDA and you say, no, when you're talking about bringing access to technology to young people, all you're talking about is young people opening internet cafes. Have we moved past the point where NYDA helps young people open internet cafes? Are they doing something a little bit more?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, I read a fantastic story over the weekend about how through community initiatives in the Eastern Cape, in the most rural parts of South Africa, people are being given access to the internet for costs as low as 25 Rand a month, right? At a policy level, we know South Africa has released a large amount of spectrum that is going to be taken up, and that spectrum allocation is really going to help to increase the amount of connectivity we have, as well as bring down data costs in South Africa, right? So I think we're having a much more universal conversation than just access to internet cafes, right? I also think that there's a much broader conversation about access to opportunities and access to education through, supporting households in South Africa. I'll give you statistics. For example, I think 90 to 95% of South African households have access to a television, but only 25% have access to a household computer, right? And if you think about the amount of things you can do on a computer, you could be doing work for, the United States or Europe, sitting at your desk in Mthatha, for example. Yeah. So I think those are critical elements, and I think, of course, bridging the digital divide is one of the important things in building a more just and a more equitable society. Yeah.
Are we not missing out on some predictable opportunities for investment, particularly one in climate change? As we speak now, you mentioned the cold weather. We've never seen snow in Joburg, which is a clear sign that there's something that is happening as far as the climate is concerned. But two, as we are speaking now in this cold, Eskom has ramped up load shedding, so we also need some innovation and investment within the green energy space. Are we not missing out on opportunities there for young people to be able to invest in those particular spaces?
I think the just energy transition presents a massive opportunity for the growth of new industries, for example. Right? We know that today in South Africa, in fact, we've been able to reduce load shedding between probably around May and July via the fact that there has been a solar tax incentive which has been announced. There's been a massive amount of renewable energy, both from a household perspective as well as a business perspective, that's been installed, right? And we know that there's a number of projects underway that are there to train young people to, for example, be solar panel installers, but also young entrepreneurs who are out there having their businesses funded to be able to be actual, to own the installation process associated with that there. Now, that's just one example, right? We know there are jobs which exist in the hydrogen economy, for example, right? We know that at Komati, for example, you have an example there where the World Bank is supporting the transition of coal-based jobs into greens and renewables jobs, right? I mean, South Africa is one of the first countries to have a partnership with developed nations where they're going to invest in South Africa's just energy transition. Yeah. So I'd say it's less of a missed opportunity. Of course, sometimes these conversations get lost in the noise of load shedding and things like that there. But I think South Africa is probably one of the countries which has really taken a massive step forward in owning a just energy transition, right? You even look at a policy perspective where we've raised the threshold for private generation in South Africa. Yeah.
But what you say, Waseem, we're not hearing that in your youth development policy, or at least we are not seeing you actively, for example, coming up with programs within that youth development policy that would create tangible investment opportunities for young people.
Well, I mean, those things definitely exist. For example, if you were to read the Integrated Youth Development Strategy, you will see that there are partnerships with energy-based companies to train young people for the type of skills that are required, In our TVET colleges, in our universities, curriculums are already being amended to train for the kind of jobs that are required by a modern and a changing green economy in South Africa, yeah? So I think that work is definitely underway. Perhaps it needs to be amplified. Perhaps there can be more communication and more noise about it. But I think the kind of initiatives are definitely there. They already exist. I'd say the one area where South Africa could probably do more is, for example, in the manufacturing space. Right? You still find that, for example, if you look at the manufacture of solar panels, 80 to 90% still comes from foreign countries, predominantly China, for example. Yeah. So as we talk about rebuilding the industrial base, rebuilding the manufacturing base, I think that could definitely happen. But I think in the skills development space, there's already a lot of exciting work happening in the country.
Back with you tonight here on In Focus. The 9th BRICS Youth Summit will be hosted by the National Youth Development Agency and is set to take place next week. For more on this, we are still in conversation with the NYDA CEO Waseem Carrim. So Waseem, the other area that was a key focus, of course, in the previous Youth Summit, you've already mentioned that this is an international platform for young entrepreneurship. When one speaks of the NYDA, we always want to ask the question whether you are creating a fair enough pipeline, right, of young entrepreneurs, but also what you are doing as far as youth economic mobility. If you look, I know 2020 was a challenging year, but we've come back and things are beginning to open. In terms of the target of entrepreneurs that you had set for yourself to achieve, that possibly could be bringing to this summit and could be taking advantage of this international platform.
Yeah, look, I mean, I just want to give you a statistic before we get to contextualize the conversation, right? Keep in mind the numbers 45, 45, 10. That's the ratio, the global average of people who are in formal employment, 45%, people who own their own small businesses or are self-employed, work in the gig economy, 45%, 10% unemployed globally. South Africa, 50% formal employment, 10% owning their own businesses, self-employed, and 40% unemployment. So you can tell where our problem is, right? Our problem is not in formal employment. Our problem is the number of people starting out their own enterprises, being self-employed, being in the gig economy, Of course, the NYDA has done a lot to try and advance youth entrepreneurship, to change the mindset away from being job seekers to job creators. And of course, once again, I know, we produced some great entrepreneurs. We've seen many young black people come up through entrepreneurship, but it's not happening at enough scale, right? And I think these kind of summits present a number of opportunities. One is access, so access to platforms and learning and networks and that type of thing. The second is the ability to exchange and understand what's happening in different countries, to take policies that have been conducive in other countries and look at how they could be applied in South Africa's context here. And then thirdly, to really try and attract, through partners where South Africa is viewed as a positive source to the global economy, trying to attract the kind of investment and funding for us to be able to support more youth enterprises in South Africa, so we can start to get that ratio up and we can really start to move our economy in the right direction.
Yeah. So talking of best practice, right, in terms of looking at what other countries are doing within the BRICS bloc, effective education reform. Last time I was speaking to you, you had the second chances program, which you were supporting, of course, that being your contribution as far as education is concerned. Is there something more that you're doing around the reform of education so that we get to a space where we are beginning to see young people with the necessary skills that respond to the economy and that are sustainable?
Yeah, so, I think when we reflect on education in South Africa, we've done a lot in terms of accessibility to education, right? So we fundamentally increased access to education. Where we've not done so well is convert learning that young people have gathered in the education system into effective earning opportunities. And I'd say there's two kind of processes underway at the moment that seek to transform the way we look at education and skills development. I think there's a lot of exciting work in the basic education system around curriculum reform, right? And you've seen in the last 3 or 4 years the introduction of subjects like coding, robotics, artificial intelligence into the curriculum itself. So as we start to train our young people for the jobs that exist in the future, yeah. The other model that I see fundamentally changing in the country is around how we train and how we skill young people. Now, the idea has always been to train for the sake of training, right? We think about our CETA model or about our training model in South Africa. We train for the sake of giving young people certificates. And often in India, young people say, we don't want certificates, we just want jobs. And I think where the model is changing a little bit is it's taking a very demand side approach, right? In using data analytics, one is able to understand what are the demand side opportunities that exist, what are employers, what are the skills that they're looking for. And you transfer the risk for training to the placement in an actual job opportunity rather than the signing of a training register, which means you're training for actual growing demand in the economy. And I think one sector where South Africa has done this effectively is in global business services, data processing centers, call centers, where South Africa has overtaken India and become the #1 destination for global business services around the world. Yeah? So those are two of the kind of shifts that we're seeing in the education and the skills development landscape. And I think another one is that how we learn as well is changing, right? Before, you had to go and sit in a lecture room and do a credited course. Many people learn nowadays through YouTube videos. They learn through electronic learning courses, yeah? So the medium of learning is also changing fundamentally. And I think what is important is that we keep up with global trends in that regard.
Yeah. Speaking of global trends, of course, you are going there to meet with other decision makers as far as the youth agenda is concerned. As South Africa, will you be going in as South African youth with a particular position on the current geopolitical tensions?
Yeah, I think South Africa's position, as dictated by our foreign policy, is pretty clear, right? We seek a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine because I think it's critical for the global world to recover. I think the war in Ukraine is not helping anybody, right? But I think we do know that geopolitically, the interests of the East and the West are certainly colliding, right? And I think that's why South Africa has taken a position of non-alignment in that regard there. But of course, we would want to seek particularly a peaceful resolution to the war that's currently happening so that the global economy can recover and that there doesn't need to be unnecessary loss of life in the world. Maybe one of the other things to mention is that South Africa is really pursuing during its chairship an exciting proposal which seeks to establish a BRICS Youth Council, right? Which will have representation of all of the countries, but will be chaired by South Africa and housed in South Africa, And this takes a similar format to, for example, the BRICS Business Council, which has really been able to expand South Africa's business interests across the world, but particularly in BRICS countries, and, for example, the New Development Bank, which now we know invests in development projects, not only in BRICS countries, but around the world. So I think this is an exciting initiative which seeks to take our work from just being locally based towards being internationally based as well.
Waseem Carrim, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on, CEO of the National Youth Development Agency.